Thank you for being with us today, whether that's in person or on Zoom. For those of you with us in person, I do remind you of Grand Valley's face covering policy and ask that you keep your mask on while indoors on campus, of course, unless you're eating or drinking. This year marks the 11th installment in the Progressive Conservative Summit for the Center's Common Ground Initiative. This endeavor remains unique in efforts in higher education today, and we are proud to be one of the few universities actively putting progressives and conservatives on stage together to explore the social, political, cultural, and economic differences of everyday Americans. This year's summit provides us the opportunity to hear from thought leaders from differing ideologies, which helps us to benefit in our civic consciousness and become more ethical and effective leaders, as our namesake, Colonel Ralph W. Hauenstein, intended. Last night, Jane Coaston set the stage for our day of programming by sharing with us the importance of engaging in good faith debate. To quote Jane, "The purpose of debate is what you're debating. You don't have to enjoy it, but you have to know why you're there. The point isn't the argument, it isn't the debate. The point is what's being debated or argued." In closing, Jane noted, "It's really important that when we focus on good faith debate, we focus less on the debate and more on the good faith." It is in this spirit that we gather here for the day's worth of programming, beginning with David's keynote and ending with our 3 keynote speakers engaging in, you guessed it, good faith debate. Please refer to your program or visit gvsu.edu/ht/ProgCon to see the day's full schedule. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce this morning's keynote speaker. David French is a senior editor at The Dispatch and a columnist for Time. A graduate of Harvard Law School, David is a former senior writer for National Review and a former senior fellow at the National Review Institute. He is a former constitutional litigator and a past president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. David is a New York Times bestselling author, and his most recent book, Divided We Fall, America's Secession Threat and How to Restore Our Nation, was released last September. Copies of Divided We Fall will be available for purchase throughout the day. David is a former major in the United States Army Reserve and is a veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom, where he was awarded the Bronze Star. Please help me welcome to the stage, David.
Well, good morning. I'm really pleased to talk to you about conservatism and defining conservatism for the modern era, and I'm actually hoping that you'll define conservatism for me because nobody seems to know what it is anymore. Nobody seems to know what it means to even be part of a quote-unquote conservative movement anymore. It is all up in the air. It is in a state of flux. On the one hand, that can be interesting and exciting. It can open up the possibility of new ideas. It can open up the possibility of new thought leaders, of new people in injecting a new stream of thought into a movement that many people had rightly said had grown, you know, a little bit inflexible, a little bit too married to some of the ideas of the recent past. And that can be good, that can be exciting. There's also a downside to it. The downside is that in a state of flux, a lot of people who don't have conservative ideas or have ideas that many would consider to be anti-conservative or against the traditional ethos and values of the conservative movement can come into in a time of turmoil and appropriate the term and attach it to ideas and movements that have really nothing to do with conservatism or a conservative sensibility. So what I'm going to talk about is how I envision the conservative movement for today. What should it mean for today? Several weeks ago, Ross Douthat at the New York Times wrote a column, and he was sort of redressing an argument that I made. And in that column, he called me David French, the famous conservative critic of conservatism. And I took issue with that on multiple fronts. One, famous. It's kind of a niche nerd sort of famous. In other words, if I'm out and someone recognizes me, I'm thinking, you're nerd. I see you. We're the same. Okay. The other thing is, critic of conservatism? I've always thought of myself as a defender of conservatism against what I see as an increasing, rising right-wing reactionary populism that is not conservative at all. And so let me talk about when I think of conservatism, what am I thinking about? What is it that and it is not necessarily Reaganism. I mean, Ronald Reagan was the president for his particular time, facing challenges of his time. One of the central defining aspects of Reaganism was opposition to the Soviet Union and American strength during the Cold War. Well, that's not operative right now, although there are lessons we can learn as China's power rises, as Russia is presenting a consistent challenge in Europe and beyond. So how did I view conservatism? What is conservatism? And I always looked at conservatism as existing on two axes. There's an ideological axis of conservatism. These are the ideas of the conservative movement. And then there was a temperamental or a dispositional aspect of conservatism. This is the character of the conservative movement. And the two things were inseparable. They were inseparable and dependent. Inseparable and mutually dependent. So what do I mean? What I mean is when you're talking about, and I'll explain why. And I'll explain why I think this definition is actually the definition we need for this time. We need for this time. Let me do a brief digression to for this time. So what is the challenge of this time in the United States of America? When Ronald Reagan was sworn in January of 1981, what was the challenge of his time? Well, he had two enormous challenges in front of him. He had a challenge of a Soviet Union that seemed to be, and it's easy to forget this if you're younger than I am. I'm kind of the break point. I'm 52 years old. If you're much younger than me, the Soviet Union is not something, it's just all in the history books. If you're older than me, you remember the Soviet Union. You remember it. And if you're much older than me, you can very keenly remember 1979, 1980, 1981, because at that time, there was a sense of conviction that we were losing a civilizational, existential struggle over the very essence and idea of American liberty, security, and prosperity, and that the Soviet Union was the rising power. So that's Ronald Reagan in 1981. This was years before the Soviet Union retreated hastily from Afghanistan. This is years before the fall of the Berlin Wall. It is difficult to overstate how much there was a sense of despair at the rising power of the Soviet Union. I remember in the 1980s, I was a nerd from way back. So it's 1985, 1984. Some people are going to concerts. I would go on occasion. I'm sitting there playing Dungeons and Dragons and reading books about the decline and fall of the American empire. I mean, these books were being written in the 1980s. Little did I know, in less than a decade, we would be the world's sole superpower, called a hyperpower by French diplomats. But that was one challenge that Reagan faced. One of the other challenges that he faced was an American economy that had an American system of regulation that had stifled human innovation and market innovation. It had stifled the ability of the American people. It had stifled entrepreneurial energy. It had stifled the ability of the American people to essentially revitalize their own economy. And so that was a challenge that Ronald Reagan faced at the time, and one of the reasons why Republicans were so attached to Reaganism for so long is because Reaganism overcame those challenges in such a decisive way. People are going to be attached to quite successful political movements. They are. And so, yeah, I think it's probably true that the Republican Party held on to Reaganism broadly defined for maybe a bit too long. But what is it that challenges us now? What is it that challenges us now? Well, we do have foreign challenges, not quite at the scale of the Soviet Union, but we do have unique foreign challenges. One of the things that we never had to deal with from the Soviet Union that we do have to deal with China, for example, is that China is an economic superpower, even more than it's a military superpower. With the Soviet Union, that was reversed. The Soviet Union was a military superpower, but we were always a much stronger economic country than the Soviet Union. So we do have foreign challenges and challenges of foreign policy. We have challenges from Europe. Russia, I've heard someone describe it as essentially a gas station with an army attached to it. Punches above its weight because that army is very large, that military is very large and strong. So we do have foreign challenges. We do have domestic challenges as well. But the domestic challenges are interesting. The domestic challenges are, yes, they're over policy. I mean, right now we're in the middle of the Democrats in the middle of furious negotiation with themselves about immense amounts of additional federal spending. We do have differences over domestic policy. But what are we really dealing with? What are we really dealing with? If you get deep, what are we really dealing with? And what we are really dealing with right now in the United States of America is a threat from both ends of the spectrum to the classical liberal American project itself. A loss of confidence and a loss of faith in the classical liberal American project itself. And rising in its stead is a wave, again, on both ends of the political spectrum that says that the American experiment is fundamentally failing, that the American story is now one of existential conflict between red and blue, and that the ultimate victors in that conflict are going to be those individuals who harness and leverage the powers of the federal government to once and for all defeat their enemies. And in that kind of existential struggle, individual liberty is dispensable. In some cases, even due process is dispensable. Limited government is dispensable. Why? Because there is an existential struggle between red and blue. I don't know if you guys saw, but on Thursday, the UVA Center for Politics released a study that said that 52% of Trump voters, 52% either strongly or somewhat wanted to see blue states leave the Union. A majority of Trump voters wanted blue states to leave the Union. Now, if you think Democrats were a lot more healthy in their view of the American Union, a little, not a lot. It was about 41% of Biden voters wanted to see red states leave the Union. That's how angry people have become. And if you dig down underneath this, what you begin to see is an extraordinary amount of misinformation and malice directed person to person in the United States. Red versus blue in the United States. Well, first, the malice. One thing that's really fascinating is the extent to which we have been able to mark, you know, when I talk about partisan division, people are always like, well, we've always been divided. I mean, even going back to the founding, I mean, remember there was a vice president who shot and killed a former secretary of the Treasury, and they made a musical about it. And you know, we've always had partisan divisions. Yeah, we've always had partisan divisions, and some of them have grown so profound that they split the country for a time. But what we're dealing now is with a kind of mass negative partisanship that we have not seen in modern times. And we've been able to trace the growth of this. So let's go prior to Trump. In 2014, the Pew Center had been doing polling on partisanship for a long period of time, and began to notice something it called negative partisanship. And what is negative partisanship? So negative partisanship is, I am a Republican not because I like Republican ideas, but because I hate or fear Democrats. Or I'm a Democrat not because I like Democrat ideas, but because I hate and fear Republicans. And they began to notice that the level of personal animosity from Democrat to Republican and Republican to Democrat was rising dramatically and at a mass scale. So by 2014, if you ask the average Republican, what do you think of the average Democrat? Do you somewhat like them, strongly like them, somewhat dislike them, strongly dislike them? The dislike, somewhat or strongly, was at about 82% dislike. Now, they asked the Democrats the same question. The Democrats were so much more tolerant. Only about 79% of them hated or strongly disliked Republicans. Now, do you think, this is 2014, has it gotten better or has it gotten worse? It's gotten worse on every measure. I could give you poll after poll that says it has gotten worse on every measure. In fact, we're even at a point where some researchers have discovered something called lethal mass partisanship. Okay, what is lethal mass partisanship? Lethal mass partisanship is where a person says, I think America would be better off if some portion of my political opponents just died. Just died. Now, I've experienced lethal micro-partisanship before, not mass partisanship. When I was first admitted to law school all the way back in 1991, I can remember writing a letter to the student. I formed a pro-life group We had about 1,500 students at Harvard Law School at the time in 1991. 3 of us got together and formed a pro-life group. So we were a small minority in the community. But one of the first things that we did was I wrote a letter to the student body telling them of a Harvard policy that if you had to pay a student health fee, part of that student health fee paid for elective abortions. But if you had a conscientious objection to funding abortions, you could write in and get a refund of a portion of your fee. Not very much, but it was important and valuable symbolic policy. I write my classmates very nicely. I was very kind about it, telling them this policy. And in sort of a preview of Twitter, the responses that I received were, and I'll quote some of them, "Why don't you go die, you effing fascist? You need to die." I remember it was like as if somebody had put out talking points. It was saying, call him a fascist, tell him to die, and use profanity in any combinations of 1 and 2. So they were not death threats, they were death aspirations. You know, I'm not gonna kill you, but somebody will, hopefully, maybe, or something. And that was my first entree into sort of this nature of politics where a disagreement was attached to it, a death wish, and a particular extremist label, fascist. Fascist, I was a fascist. Well, fast forward to 2021, and what was fascinating is you began to see the way in which that labeling had leaked from Harvard Law School into the general public, so that a strong majority of Republicans said Democrats were socialists, and a majority of Democrats said Republicans were fascists. Okay, if these words still have meaning, that's a false allegation. It's a false allegation. An increase in government spending doesn't necessarily make a nation socialist. Socialism, a word with a meaning. A rise of populism doesn't necessarily make a movement fascist. Fascism is a word with a meaning. So this is what I talk about when I talk about animosity combined with misinformation. It's interesting. There's a group called More in Common that has studied America's quote-unquote hidden tribes. Their thesis is there's more than just red and blue in this country. And they've found about 8 distinct tribes of Americans running through the political and dispositional spectrum. And what they found was the people who spend the most time on political media and social media are the most wrong about their political opponents. Now I'm going to say that again. The people who spend the most time on political media and social media, meaning like probably all of us in this room, are the most wrong about their political opponents. How are they the most wrong? They're the most wrong by overestimating their opponent's extremism. So if you spend a lot of time on Fox News or if you spend a lot of time on MSNBC, you're going to think that the median Republican or average Republican is several points to the right of where they really are. And you're going to think that the median or average Democrat is several points to the left of where they really are. So here's what we have. We have malice and we have misinformation that is creating a sense of existential crisis and mortal threat. Okay? That's the situation of American politics today. That is the dominant emotion response that people are having to American politics. It is not actually a furious debate over tax rates, although tax rates are important. It is not actually a furious debate over deficits. The deficits are important. If you could right now lay out for me all of the nuances and the differences between Biden and Trump's strategic military approach to China, I don't know what I have to give you, but you deserve an award because you're in a tiny, tiny, tiny minority of Americans. When I was growing up and when I was in college, you used to be able to pack out thousands strong evening debates about American nuclear policy towards the Soviet Union on college campuses. Thousands of students listening to debates between professors about things like the Minuteman missile or the MX missile or the B-1 bomber. I mean, that was the kind of substance that we're dealing with. So what are we dealing with now? What we're dealing with now, I think, is an existential crisis that we have created ourselves through malice and misinformation that magnifies our differences and is causing us to want to abandon, because the emergency is too great, the classical liberal structure of our country. All right, so what do I think that conservatism should be? I think of conservatism as this. I think at this point, at this time in our history, the project of conservatism is the defense of and the extension of the American Revolution. It's the defense of the principles and the extension of the principles of the American Revolution on a full spectrum basis. So here's what I mean by that. We've got a lot of fights over history. We have a lot of fights over history. We've had a 1619 project that for a time, at least until it was stealth edited, tried to claim that 1619, the advent of the first slaves to the New World brought into Jamestown Colony, that was the true founding of the United States of America. And then you had an opposition to that, sort of a 1776 project that says, no, 1619 project is fundamentally wrong. Here's, what we're going to do is we're going to engage in a project. And the problem I had with it was an ideological answer, not a historical answer. Here's where I think where we really are. Okay, this is, if you want to track American history, here's the frame I attach to it. In 1619, when the first slaves arrived on our shores, not only was it a profane and profound injustice all on its own, it was also an important symbol or signal that this new civilization was going to be very much like all of the old civilizations that came before it. The default reality of human affairs has been warfare, exploitation, slavery for a very, very, very long time. And so what 1619 signified was that this new civilization was going to be like the civilizations that came before it. Now, and then in many ways, the civilization that began to emerge did mirror the civilizations that came before it. There was a series of destructive wars against Native Americans. There was the spread of slavery, particularly in the Southeast. But then along comes 1776. And what did 1776 do? 1776, through imperfect men who were often engaged in oppressive behavior themselves, set up and articulated a series of principles that were directly contradictory to that spirit of 1619. That spirit of 1619 that says slavery, war, exploitation, the strong prey on the weak, might makes right, was set against, we're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the history that began to follow was in many ways a battle between the spirit of 1619 and the spirit of 1776, because those two things were ultimately incompatible. The spirit of 1619 was incompatible with the spirit of 1776. And the spirit of 1776 advanced, and sometimes we'd have 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. For a time, slave power extended and was magnified in the United States of America. So we'd have 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, but then we would sometimes take 5 steps forward with only maybe 1 or 2 steps back. And when the spirit of 1776, which I'd look at the Declaration of Independence as something along the lines of a mission statement in a corporation, right? It doesn't have any binding force and effect. It's sort of, this is what we aspire to be. This is what we aspire to do. But then you need bylaws. You need an actual corporate governance structure that provides some meat on those bones. And that's the Constitution. So then if you have the spirit of 1776 with this great statement about the defense of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, what operationalized that? Well, what operationalized that more concretely than anything else was the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights took a collection, these rights are the fundamental aspects of the American social compact. Fundamentally. So there's, on the one hand, the Bill of Rights. This is articulating the basic minimum level of liberties that incorporates you into this American social compact. But then the Constitution did something else. It set up a structure. And that structure of limited government, and by the way, this is just a trigger for me. If anyone ever, don't come up to me and say the phrase co-equal branches of government, okay? I strongly, it's trigger warning, do not say that to me. Our Constitution was not created with co-equal branches of government. They could check each other, for sure, but the legislature was supreme. The legislature was supreme. The branch of government closest to the people was designed to be supreme. How do we know it's supreme? Not only did it control the power of the purse, not only did it control the power to declare war, it could fire the president. It could fire any member of Congress, any member of the Supreme Court. If you can fire me, you're my boss, ultimately. Okay, so the legislature was intended to be supreme as a firewall against the kind of tyranny and sort of the union, the monarchical union of power, head of state, head of army, head of church, head of government that you had in the European kings. So we turned that upside down. The branch closest to the people was going to have the most power. So there's a structure, and then there's an articulation of liberties. And what was the goal here? The most important Federalist paper for you to read is Federalist number 10. Go read number 10, James Madison. Because what were the founders concerned about? One of the things that they were concerned about almost more than anything else was what they called the violence of faction. In other words, the rise of factions in the government or in and out of the government that could threaten this new union. And so what James Madison was talking about, and this is Madisonian, what some people call Madisonian federalism, Madisonian democracy. This is one of the first early articulations of American pluralism, was that our way of dealing with the violence of faction was essentially to expand the sphere of the republic so that multiple factions could exist within it and multiple factions could thrive within it. That any given faction wouldn't see another as an existential threat because there was room for both, or room for all. This was very famously articulated by George Washington. More than 50 times in his writing, or about 50 times in his writing, he referred to a verse from the book of Micah in the Old Testament. It's Micah 4:4. Now, this has been popularized by Lin-Manuel Miranda in the musical Hamilton. He put it in George Washington's mouth as is historically accurate. But at a key moment after the founding of the country, after George Washington's ascent to the presidency, after the ratification of the Constitution, Washington wrote a Hebrew congregation in Rhode Island that was very concerned about what is going to be the place of this most persecuted religious minority in the United States of America. And Washington responded with these words that have echoed in history. He said, "Every man," quoting from Micah, "shall sit under his own vine and his own fig tree, and no one shall make him afraid." In other words, this community can have its place of security and safety here in the United States. So that was step one of actualizing the American Revolution. The big next step two of actualizing the American Revolution was not just the Union victory in the Civil War, it was the passage of the Civil War amendments. Now, why is that? Why is that? Well, the original Constitution suffered from what almost turned out to be a fatal flaw. As part of the necessary compromises that would have bound the original colonies together, the Bill of Rights and the Constitution limited the power of the federal government. They did not limit the power of state governments. State governments, in theory, could, so long as the oppression was coming through the state government and not through the federal government, such as an oppression of slavery, that was going to be legal and lawful and permissible, even in a 1776 created American Republic. That's how slavery was lawful. It was coming through the power of state governments. It was coming through localities. And so what the Civil War amendments did ultimately was say, look, the guarantee of liberty isn't a real guarantee unless it applies to every layer of American government, not just the federal government. The federal government might theoretically have more power than any other level of government to interfere with liberty, to deprive individuals of liberty, but the state governments are quite efficient at it, as we saw with the rise of Jim Crow. So what does this mean for conservatism? I think of conservatism as, number one, it has to include a robust defense of the Bill of Rights as the fundamental American social compact. And you might say, well, duh. No, this is an enormous part of American history, is the continual back and forth between the protection and the threats of the Bill of Rights. One of the worst aspects of the Obama administration was the systematic removal of due process protections, Fifth and 14th Amendment protections from college students on college campuses as part of a desire, an understandable desire, to try to stamp out the scourge of campus sexual assault. But rising crime does not remove the Fifth Amendment. Rising crime or rising sexual assaults do not remove the 14th Amendment. One of the primary threats that we see today is a growing threat to free speech and a desire that the government step in to do more to regulate the speech of private entities. Why? Often because the people who are running the private entities don't share our politics, and therefore the government has to do something about it. It's a threat to fundamental American liberties. So the Bill of Rights there's always been a threat to the Bill of Rights. The exact same generation that ratified the Constitution passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. It's one of the reasons why I am not always convinced when somebody throws an 18th century or a 19th century statute at me and says, this is what the Constitution really means. Oh, really? So then the Alien and Sedition Acts are part of the original intent of the First Amendment? No, I don't believe in the 19th century infallibility thesis. So we've always had threats to the Bill of Rights. So centering a defense around the Bill of Rights, I think it's fundamental to a healthy conservatism. What's another thing that's fundamental to a healthy conservatism? Turning our government system back right side up instead of upside down. And by that I mean draining power from the executive branch of the government and returning it to the legislatures. Restoring the balance of power that was articulated in our government. And I can't tell you how important this is. This is absolutely critically important because our Constitution was not made to work, and our republic was not made to work with the concentrated power in the executive branch in the United States of America. It was not made to work like that. It is, the more we concentrate power in the executive branch, the more we're recreating the kind of governmental structure that we seceded from in 1776. Increasingly now, the power to declare war is exclusively within the presidency. Legislation, most real legislation that impacts your rights as an American is now actually regulation coming from the executive branch of government. The growth of the power of the judicial branch is inseparable from the growth of the power of the executive branch because the executive branch chooses judges. And so what you end up having is a situation where we're recreating George III. That's what we're doing every 4 years as we continue to magnify power in the executive branch of government. We're doing it on purpose, and we're doing it consistently and constantly because we get frustrated at the lack of Congress's inability to do anything, and rather than hold them accountable, we turn to a president and say, save us, protect us. I really don't like this phrase that happens all the time that says, you know, this is the most important election of my lifetime. Every election of my lifetime has been the most important election of my lifetime. I would go back and I can think of one or two that in hindsight were more important than others. But I will say this, as the executive branch increases in power, what's happening is that every election we are electing the most important, the most powerful president in the peacetime history of the United States, because we're throwing more and more power to the executive branch. So I think a healthy conservatism says, let's make this right side up instead of upside down. More powerful elected representatives, strong defense of civil liberties. These things are the underpinnings of our classical liberal system. Now you might say, to what end? To what end? Well, the other thing when you turn it upside down, from upside down to right side up, what do? You empower, under our constitutional system, states and localities to govern themselves. So another aspect of conservatism is federalism, is localism. Depending on where I go, I change the term. Because if I'm talking to a deep blue audience and I say federalism, they think, oh, states' rights, Jim Crow. But a healthy defense of the Bill of Rights eliminates that threat. But I will say localism, because reminds people of like going to a restaurant where they eat like locally grown chicken. Localism sounds good and federalism sounds bad. So whatever word you want to put to it, pushing government control to where communities, local communities, have a greater ability to enact policies that advance their values is critical. It's critical. Think about this. If the president is the most powerful governmental entity in the United States, and the federal government has more power over your life than it has ever had in the history of the United States, peacetime, think about how frustrating it is if you live, and you think about it for 5 seconds, if you live, well, you guys are in a swing state. I don't even know what that's like. I have never lived in a swing state in my life. I have never cast a meaningful vote for the most powerful office in the world in my entire life. I've either lived in a deep red state or a deep blue state. In many ways, I'm cut off from participation, meaningful participation in the most fundamental election in American democracy. It's not supposed to be. It's not supposed to be. But it is. But it is. And so by pushing power down to local levels, and one of the things that you have to do when power is pushed down to local levels is you can't get too ticked off if the other side wins in a place where you don't live. This is something that's, with the nationalization of American politics, is unbelievable. I feel like Fox News needs to set up a bureau at the Loudoun County School Board in Northern Virginia, because judging from the news coverage, the Loudoun County School Board must run us all because of the amount of attention paid to whether or not it's going to adopt a mask mandate or CRT in the curriculum. I don't care what Loudoun County schools want to do with Loudoun County schools. I might have a preference if I lived there. I know I'd have a preference if I lived there, but we have to allow local governments to run their localities and enact the policies consistent with the Constitution that advance their values. So, I've been through a lot of history. I've been through a lot of philosophy. What does this mean when we turn the situation upside down to where we have more localism, we have more liberty, and we have less executive authority? Now, it goes back to the other element that I mentioned. In my view, conservatism has always had a dispositional or a characterological element. If our advocacy as conservatives is for more liberty, there is a responsibility that comes with that. Liberty cannot be disconnected from responsibility. I am free. It is the obligation of the government to grant me liberty. It is my obligation as a citizen to exercise that liberty virtuously and responsibly. If I have more economic freedom, it is my responsibility as a citizen to exercise that economic freedom with industry and integrity. Liberty carries with it responsibility. So if a conservative movement is inseparable from liberty, it cannot be separated from character and responsibility. It cannot. It will not work. The whole system will not work. In fact, John Adams, of course, recognized that in his letter to the Massachusetts militia. He said, "Our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It's wholly inadequate to the governance of any other." Wholly inadequate. You should read the whole letter. It's fascinating. He talks about if we're overcome by avarice, by ambition, by greed, if we're overcome by our vices, those vices will pass through the cords of our Constitution like a whale going through a net. That's the way that he put it, like a whale going through a net. So liberty is inseparable from responsibility. Liberty is inseparable from character. So you can now begin to see how I feel a little out of step with the modern right. Okay, so the modern right is saying in many ways, less liberty and character optional. In many ways, character undesirable. Character undesirable. Because if you have some character, that's going to put some limits on your ability to fight. To fight. I'm still unclear what fighting means. It usually means tweeting like a giant jerk, but which is not really fighting in any really meaningful sense. But this is where I think the conservative world, the conservative movement has to zig where the rest of the culture is trying to zag. We need to move more towards liberty and character and federalism and localism and away from authoritarianism, centralized control, and mortal political combat with morality optional. Because if you go down that road, not only are you, from a pragmatic standpoint, almost certain to lose in the long run, and whichever side of the political aisle moves more dramatically in that way is more likely to lose in the long run. Why is that? Because one of the interesting findings in the More in Common study was that the people who are most motivated by politics are a decided minority in the United States. A decided minority. There is what they called an exhausted majority. And some of you might be a member of that exhausted majority in this audience. And the exhausted majority is people from the left and people from the right. It's not the moderate middle. I mean, there are certain moderates there, but the exhausted majority are the people who look at the polarized wings and see anger and irrationality and an unwillingness to compromise and are sick of it. They're sick of it. And right now what that exhausted majority is largely doing is checking out rather than exerting their will. I'll give you a good example. Talking to a doctor friend I live in Franklin, Tennessee, super red part of the country. And he says after January 6th, he just turned off everything. He turned off he turned off Fox News, he deleted Twitter and Facebook from his phone. He started watching more sports, reading more history, and he said, my blood pressure's gone down, I'm a nicer person. And I thought, well, good for you, but bad for us, because he's a good guy with a lot of good thoughts to contribute. But right now, what's happening is our politics have become so toxic that a large number of people look at it as like touching the third rail, not just if you're a public figure or a pundit, but you're just a private citizen. How many people really want to have that conversation about vaccines again? How many people really want to have that conversation about CRT again? Because even in little family groups, you're going to be sparking furious confrontation. And so what's happening is this exhausted majority is checking out. They're saying, I'm sick of it. But there's the key word there is majority. Majority. Because if you look at the wings on both sides, the total number of the really politically engaged Americans is around 33%. Around 33%. And that means on each side, it's a minority of a minority that is really engaged. And so there is an enormous amount of latent power that exists in the exhausted majority. And one of the things that I submit is that the next great political movement in the US, the next political movement that can do what Reaganism did in the early 1980s, is the one that can connect with that exhaustion and provide them a sense of animating purpose and hope. That's where the possibility lies. Who can connect with the exhausted majority and provide with them a coherent vision of purpose and hope to get us past this moment of crisis? That's where I think the future lies. That's where I think we need leadership. I'll end with this and then I'll open with questions. One of the things that's really interesting and fascinating is the power of leadership. The power of leadership. I used to be one of these folks who kind of, maybe a little skeptical about the power of leadership to really transform or focus, nations, cultures. I'm no longer a skeptic. There's even some interesting social science data that backs this up. I was listening to a great podcast from my colleagues at the Dispatch. Subscribe, thedispatch.com. Anyway, and they were talking to a Republican pollster. And they were asking about some of the permanence of a lot of the ideas that have been attached to the rise of Trump. A greater confidence in centralized power, a greater confidence in or desire for centralized government control of the economy, less of an influence on, less of a emphasis on fiscal responsibility, et cetera, et cetera. And he said something interesting. He said, a lot of that is completely contingent upon who the leader of the party is. That what ends up happening is you have large numbers of Americans that really aren't all that ideological. They're not. But if they see someone winning and something working, they move in that direction. And they will move where they go with the flow. They go with the flow. I mean, you see this all the time. You can take an identical policy idea and you can ask a set of Americans, example, Donald Trump supports Medicare for all. Do you agree with Donald Trump? the Republican yes answer will go through the roof. Ask the same question. Joe Biden agrees with Medicare for all. I mean, these are made up. Neither one of them agrees with Medicare for all, but Joe Biden agrees with Medicare for all. Republican numbers go through the floor. The power of leadership really matters, really matters. Think about this. If you don't think movements can turn in a better and more virtuous direction in a relatively short amount of time, 1974, Nixon, who was no one's idea of a Reagan Republican, resigns in disgrace. The Republican Party is mired in corruption. It has been on the receiving end of an electoral wipeout in 1974. It is nowhere in Congress. It is in the House. It is nowhere in the Senate. The Republican Party, before it was wiped out, was the party of wage and price controls. Wage and price controls. The party of the Christmas bombing. By 1975, it was also the party of the fall of Saigon. I mean, that's Gerald Ford. I mean, that was bipartisan, but Gerald Ford was in office in 1975 when you had the helicopters lifting off from the embassy. 6 years later, a president is elected who is unrecognizably different from Richard Nixon in manner, in ideology, and effect. Movements can change quickly. They need vision, they need hope, they need a sense of possibility, and that is what's lacking on the right as a competition to the rise of populism. And who can offer that vision? I don't know. Who will offer that vision? I don't know. But I do believe that it's necessary to offer it. All right. Thank you, guys, and let's do some questions.
Hello. There's one thing that's not mentioned in the Constitution that basically is running this country. The legislature sends the bureaucrats a skeleton, and the bureaucrats put the meat on it. If you were to take the Federal Code of Federal Regulations, it would go from this point about this point.
Are you sure it's that small?
Pardon me?
Are you sure it's that small? I thought it would be longer.
Well, I haven't looked at a hard copy in a long time. But what do we do about the bureaucrats? They're the ones that are running the country, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was talking about when I was talking about the executive branch. So the executive agencies, these are the bureaucrats. And you're exactly right. What we're seeing is the rise of Congress. I could have given a whole hour and not scratched the surface on how crappy Congress is right now. But what Congress essentially does, and has done for a time, is that it will write legislation that even as long as it is, it's written with gaps intentionally there. They're to be filled in. Remember when Nancy Pelosi said about Obamacare, we got to pass the bill to find out what's in it. Everyone kind of laughed at that, ha ha, read it. No, she was actually right, because you couldn't even know what Obamacare really was until it was passed, because the executive agencies had to finish the bill. That's crazy. How much time did we spend in American politics arguing about the contraception mandate in Obamacare? The better part of a decade, more than a decade. It's not in Obamacare. It's a regulatory enactment under Obamacare. So there's a couple of things that we can do. The big thing that has to be done, and this is where Congress has to do what the founders expected it and wanted it to do, to begin to have some a sense of institutional responsibility as well as partisan responsibility. Because right now Congress views itself as purely as a member of Congress, by and large, not all of them, view themselves almost entirely as a partisan actor and mainly as a pundit. So one of the big goals, a lot of people laughed at this young Republican Congressman, Madison Cawthorn, who said, I'm going to focus my policy, I'm not going to focus on policy, I'm going to focus on comms, on communications. Or, ha ha, what are you doing? Well, he's exactly responding to what Congress has become. My colleague Jonah Goldberg calls it the Parliament of Pundits. It's as if you run for Congress to be on Fox or MSNBC. So we have to get some institutional responsibility back into Congress. And the other thing is, there are some concrete judicial decisions that could be made in the next year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, that could really undermine the ability of the executive branch agencies to run our lives. This is where, let me get nerdy for a minute. How many know that Chevron is not just a gas station? Oh, I love a nerdy audience. Okay. So there's this decision called Chevron that dates back to the 1980s that says that courts will defer to administrative agency interpretations of congressional enactments. In other words, if Congress passes Obamacare and then HHS writes regulations under Obamacare, then the courts are generally going to have a hands-off approach to that and say, by default, the agency's interpretation of its mandate is going to win out. By removing Chevron, what you would do is you would remove that judicial deference to the executive branch. And by removing that judicial deference to the executive branch, it's going to require a heck of a lot more rigor and almost will kind of force Congress to do more. Here's another one. Who here has heard of the non-delegation doctrine? All right, man, I love this audience. Okay. Non-delegation doctrine is a doctrine that essentially says there are some powers that Congress has that it cannot delegate to the executive branch or to any other branch of government. It cannot constitutionally. That doctrine has been largely dead. It's just almost been stripped of any meaning and power at all. And but we have seen some signs of life recently. There's at least 4 justices who are pretty strong on wanting to revive it, and we think it could be as many as 5 or 6 now. You revive non-delegation, and you're going to make Congress do its job. Here's a great example of where non-delegation really should matter. Wherever you stand on vaccine mandates, my general view is they should come through the democratic process. Okay? If Congress wants to enact a vaccine mandate in the workplace, in those workplaces that are covered by Interstate Commerce Clause, it should do it. Okay? But what's happening now is on both an eviction moratorium until it got struck down and on the upcoming OSHA vaccine mandate, essentially what the president, the executive branch is doing is saying these really broad statutes are broad enough to allow lawmaking on that basis. The non-delegation doctrine should shut that down. And that's not the courts saying we're against vaccine mandates, although that would be the way it'd be reported in the media. It's the court saying, that's not your job. Your job is not lawmaking. It is the lawmaker's job to make law. So I agree with you completely. One of the things that we have to do, though, is there is one thing between speaking to an audience of highly engaged political folks who know what the non-delegation doctrine is and Chevron, and going out to everyone who's busy with their lives, getting their kids to soccer practice, etc., and say, here's how reviving the constitutional structure can make your life better. That's the lift. That's the thing that's hard. That's the interesting thing about what Reagan, for example, and I hate to keep going back to him, and I'm not going back to him from a policy blueprint, but from a communications blueprint, is he spent a decade barnstorming around America explaining a particular vision of what conservatism can and should be. And so that when he came into office, he had a fully formed ideological view that he had spent a lot of time implanting in the hearts and minds of the American people. And that's what we need when we're talking about executive overreach. We got to be able to figure out a way to tell people who are moderately politically engaged, we don't need that much authority in the executive branch, and it's making your life worse and more miserable because that exists. And I think that's one of our challenges.
You've done a really great job of putting a lot of detail into an explanation of where we are and how we got there and where conservatism is and everything, and I really appreciate it. My question is, and when you're out here, when you're on the line or you're not involved in the detail, always looking for some way to describe the issue, is it fair to say that we're still fighting the difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution?
I have written that multiple times. Yes, we
Thank you.
That's one of the interesting arguments, because if you go from the category of sort of political nerd to sort of mega nerd or hyper nerd, you're going to know that there's been a fight within the right-wing world over liberalism itself, small L liberalism itself, classical liberalism. And what I would submit is that a lot of people who are critics of the American classical liberal product are really fighting against the French Revolution, whereas the conservative movement is trying to preserve the American Revolution. And these were two very, very, very different revolutions. And one of the things that you see, the French Revolution was not just a set of doctrines, it was also a spirit that was different from the American Revolution. The American Revolution had a set of doctrines, and it also had a temperament. And if you want to read the difference, I can't recommend more Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. So what was the ideological disposition and the spirit of the French Revolution compared to the American Revolution? And historians in the room, forgive me for massive overgeneralization, but even if I'd only have 15 minutes if I didn't take another question. But here's my massive overgeneralization. The French Revolution really did not place in a concrete way limits on majority rule. And so it could be swept up by the fervor of the mob, and we saw that it was swept up by the fervor of the mob. And it also was fundamentally, in many ways, utopian, okay? So essentially what the French Revolution said is we can create kind of this perfect society. I mean, look at the way they dealt with history. They even at one point had a movement where they started with year zero. They renamed the months. I think we're in Thermidor right now, maybe. I don't know, it feels like we're in Thermidor back in Tennessee. But they renamed the months. They tore down, they ripped through churches. They would place a goddess of reason in town squares or even in churches. I mean, it was utopian, it was majoritarian, it was given to mob rule. Now, this is one of the things that you see often in the illiberal actions of the far left and the far right in this country. They're utopian in the sense that if we win, we can remake American society in our own image. They're, on the left in particular, majoritarian, because the left feels pretty confident that it has a majority of the American population. And it's they're untethered by a regard for individual liberty. So the American Revolution was anti-utopian. If you read the founders, they were saying again and again, people have problems. They're greedy, they're ambitious. If you give them power, they'll abuse power. The founders were very consistent in identifying the problems in humanity, which is why they shunned concentrated power in all of its forms, including majoritarianism. That's the Bill of Rights right there. It's counter-majoritarian. It says if you're a minority of one, you could belong to a religion of one. I mean, if I wasn't a Christian, I might be the only member of the religion of DC is greater than Marvel. You could be a religion of one, but you're going to have an irreducible level of civil liberties that no person can take, no government can take from you. And that's a big difference. So what we're talking about is a utopian movement versus a movement that shunned utopianism, a movement that indulged in and facilitated mob rule versus a movement that was deeply suspicious of the mob, and then a movement as a result that often deviated towards concentrated power versus a movement that was suspicious of concentrated power in any branch. And so these things were very different from each other. They were very different. And I do think that what we have in this country is a French revolutionary spirit in many ways against an American revolutionary spirit, which is why I think that American conservatism should be firmly on the side of the American revolutionary spirit.
Thanks so much. I've learned a lot from your talk, so I really appreciate you coming here. And it strikes me when you go through your prescription for conservatism that isn't it a prescription for, and I think it comes off your last answer, not just protecting minority rights, but actually giving the majority of the country a veto or giving them the power. Because if you think about defense of the Bill of Rights, well, with a conservative court, right, they're able to use interpretation of the Bill of Rights to defend on particular social issues, conservative positions. And by shifting power to the legislature, of course, it's gridlocked, and gerrymandered in different ways, so it sort of gives the minority of the country, the red states, power to block all, effective legislation, right? And likewise with federalism, of course, that's been a long-time conservative goal. So from a progressive reading of that, well, that's sort of a prescription of sort of frustrating progressives who think they have the majority. I mean, it's not the progressives who are assaulting the state, right, in the coup. So would you support, so a progressive might say, I'll go with you, but would you support ending gerrymandering and enlarging the House to make Congress, maybe something that could be more effectual?
Yeah, so expand the House, I'm all about that. I would absolutely want to expand the House. Ending gerrymandering doesn't get you what you think it gets you. Because the interesting thing is we have self-gerrymandered. If you look at American populations, it's highly concentrated. The left side of the spectrum is highly concentrated in small urban areas. There's really interesting, geographically small urban areas, population immense. If you did actual compact districts that were sort of laid out geographically, you might have less left-wing representation rather than more because there's such a compact concentration of people. New York Times put it this way, a New York Times piece a couple years ago, they said, look, if you're in Brooklyn and you're really upset about gerrymandering, even if you got rid of gerrymandering, the effects are marginal compared to more people who live in Brooklyn moving to the suburbs of Des Moines. That hyper-concentrated populations to create proportional representation have to be gerrymandered. So it's one of the things you see like with Chicago and Illinois. Chicago is hyper-concentrated blue. The rest of Illinois is pretty red. If you're going to have relatively balanced representation versus the population, you're going to have a whole bunch of districts sort of snaking in to bite off a piece of Chicago. So I think the gerrymandering point is a little overdone. Expand this House, yes. The other thing, though, is I think what's the appeal to someone who's more progressive than me about the thing that I've laid out? To me, the thing that's more appealing is you get to run your community. You have greater freedom to run your community according to your values. So here's what's interesting about the U.S. It's about a 51-49 nation. But how people vote in what election is greatly dependent. Is it midterm? Is it a presidential year? There's no stable legislative majority. We have not seen stable legislative majorities for a generation, okay? But about 80% of Americans live in states where one side or the other essentially controls the state. So about 80% of Americans live in what are called trifecta jurisdictions, which is where the lower chamber, the upper chamber, and the governor's mansion are all in the hands of the same party. It's about 80% of us. So about 80% of us live in a place where, if you're in that majority, you live in a place where your government, in theory, has the ability, if it had the authority, it would have the ability to enact policies that advance your values. And from healthcare to the environment, to economic policy, to taxation. And so my pitch to progressives is basically this. And localism and federalism would grant you greater ability to shape your community the way you want it shaped. But the problem with that is you would have to then allow other jurisdictions to shape themselves the way they want to be shaped. Let California be California. I don't have to live there. Let Tennessee be Tennessee. Nancy Pelosi is way too important to my life. Marsha Blackburn is way too important to a San Franciscan's life. The problem is that federalism, the great enemy of federalism right now is animosity. It's animosity because you can't let your opponent get anything anywhere. That's what I'm talking about, like this obsession that happens on the right with Loudoun County schools. Like it's somehow a defeat for the GOP if a blue plus 20 jurisdiction is run in a progressive manner. What are we talking about here? And you also see an enormous amount of attention paid to my school district, Williamson County, Tennessee, which has trended for some pretty bad reasons of late. Like, for example, anti-mask protesters threatening the lives of pro-mask doctors and nurses. Bad, bad, bad. It should not happen. It is also not that relevant to a person in Brooklyn. It's just not that relevant. It's kind of our problem, and it's a problem. So we've nationalized so many of these local disputes, so much so that we feel a sense of anger if we're on Twitter one night and we see that like a kid had his MAGA hat knocked off his head in a Burger King in Des Moines. Yeah, that's bad. I wouldn't want to see that happen. But all of it feeds in, by nationalizing everything, all of it feeds into this constant narrative of constant conflict and siege. So that's why I say that sense of animosity and that sense of anger is one of the greatest impediments to federalism, because you have to be able to be willing to let the other side get what it wants where it has political control.
Federalism has many commendable features, especially in theory.
Yeah.
But the world's a very different place from 1776. So what does it do for us when you have issues that increasingly are national or even global, like a pandemic or climate change?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. But let's deal with climate change for a moment. One of the problems that we have is by saying that a response to climate change has to be national, has meant that we've limited the ability of localities that want to do more to address climate, limited their ability to do that. So what you end up with, as you reach for the national solution that is not going to happen under the current gridlock, you deny yourself the local solution that will make the situation better. So I was talking with somebody, for example, they said, well, okay, wait a minute, we could enact policies in California, but if Texas is doing stuff, and I said, well, wait a minute, but if you get nothing, if you don't get anything, and California is the 5th largest economy in the whole world, I mean, we're talking almost a Germany scale economy here. Do you care about Germany's climate policies? Yeah, of course I do. Well, then why do you look at California's as if it is only part of this larger whole? Isn't the emissions equation going to be meaningfully moved if the 5th largest economy in the world adopts policies that directly address carbon emissions? Of course it is. Of course it is. But what we constantly do is we make the universal the enemy of the unattainable universal, the enemy of the attainable partial. And so this is one of the things that what politicians are constantly doing is they're constantly selling their constituents on what's fundamentally false, which is I can create a national solution that is going to deal with this issue, and they cannot. They cannot. I mean, I remember in 2010 living in Tennessee, watching individual congressmen running on, if you vote us in 2010, we'll repeal Obamacare. And literally as if there had never been any such thing invented as a veto. As if they were running on an impossible platform. Just impossible. There was no way they were going to repeal Obamacare, and yet they were selling it to millions of Americans, and then Americans say Obamacare is not repealed, and they go, you failed. It's not so much you failed, it's you lied. You lied. You said you could do what you couldn't do. And we're constantly doing that about national solutions. And and what that means is that becomes the enemy of the local solution, which might not be a full solution, but it's a partial solution. And the pandemic is interesting. There are some things, for example, that a federal response to greater or lesser degrees is absolutely necessary. National defense is one. The regulation of interstate commerce is another one. The response to public health, a public health issue from the very beginning, from the founding of the U.S., public health has been an area which the police power of states has always been at its apex. That is when states have the maximum power is to deal with a matter of contagious pandemic. The federal government, though, however, is still a government of enumerated powers. A pandemic doesn't remove the Constitution, but a pandemic does empower states to a degree, and this is one of the reasons why we have seen such dramatically different state policies, and one of the reasons why we're seeing some pretty different state outcomes is because of this difference. But there's a necessity of a federal response to some things, absolutely. To say you're for federalism doesn't mean you completely gut the national government, but you're pushing You're just gently pushing more and more to localities. But we cannot let the unattainable universal be the enemy of the attainable partial solution.
So we have time for one more question, and it's from Zoom on my watch.
On your watch.
Yes. Is there any potential for a third party that would represent the majority of moderates?
You never say never. You never say never, but I don't know, some of you might remember I had a very brief and bizarre flirtation with a third party run for president in 2016. One of the things that deterred me from doing it is I realized that we had a movement, it was just there were only dozens of us. But one of the things when you sort of dive into the mechanics of challenging the two-party system is that you really see that there are an immense amount of formal barriers and formal legal mechanisms and a lot of habits and patterns that inhibit the rise of a truly competitive third party. It's very difficult. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm saying that it's very, very difficult. So where is the main possibility for reform? One of the main possibilities of reform, quite frankly, is getting more of the exhausted majority to vote in primaries. To vote in primaries. What we're trapped in this dynamic right now that's terrible, because the dynamic is essentially this. Only a minority of interested voters will vote in primaries. The minority of interested voters who vote in primaries tend to be the most committed and often most extreme members of a party's constituency. Then, after they produce a candidate that reflects the values of a minority of the party, and definitely a minority of the country, they then say to you, binary choice, you gotta choose between these two candidates that if you were choosing, both are unsatisfactory. But binary choice, binary choice, binary choice. The way to break that knot is to have greater engagement in the primaries. It's I hate to say it's that simple, but it's pretty simple. Because what you have, especially in deep red districts like where I live, I'll tell you this, there are representatives, especially state representatives, who are acting exactly like miniature versions of Marjorie Taylor Greene, even though they profoundly disagree with Marjorie Taylor Greene because they're convinced that a Marjorie Taylor Greene will successfully primary them if they don't toe that line. And so there has to be greater public engagement of the exhausted majority. I've said it like this many times. The operative word of exhausted majority has to move away from exhausted and towards majority. And again, that requires leadership that provides people with purpose and hope enough to at least get them out of the chair and into the voting booth at a higher frequency, and especially in primaries. That's not to say that a third party isn't out of the question. There have been third party movements in America. The Republican Party was a third party. It was a third party. But it's been a long time since we've had anything meaningful like that. It's very, very hard. It seems to me to be a lighter lift to say, get the exhausted majority animated than it is to create a third party movement. All right, that's it. Thank you guys very much.